Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I share my recent presentation that was part of the UVU Provost COVID-19 academic seminar series on developing meaningful work within the COVID-19 context and beyond. Welcome back to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In today's episode, I'm sharing my presentation from Monday's UVU Provost COVID-19 Scholarly Seminar Series about creating meaningful work amidst COVID-19 and implications for managers moving into the post-pandemic world. This is really a combination of both a scholarly and a practitioner-oriented presentation. I combine elements of two presentations that I made over the summer to share with the UVU academic community. I hope you enjoy. Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to share some work with all of you on campus. As you can see here, the title of my presentation today is Designing Meaningful Work During COVID-19, Implications for Managers and the Future of Work. And so when the call for possible presentations for the seminar series went out, I immediately thought that this would be a good one to share with the campus community. It's actually a combination of two different presentations that I did over the summer for the International Society for Quality of Life Studies. They're celebrating their 25th anniversary this year, and they do practitioner-oriented webinars. So I did one version of this presentation that was for managers and leaders, and then they have an annual conference like most academic societies do. Because of COVID, their conference went completely remote, and so I had the opportunity, I think it was in August, to share the more scholarly side of the research and going a little bit more into depth on that. So what I plan to present today is basically a combination of those two elements, and hopefully have a good mix of practitioner-oriented types of applicable information that any of you across campus might be able to utilize, but also talk a little bit more in detail about the research and the methodology and the statistics and things like that as well. As I get started, I do also want to just acknowledge colleagues that I've worked with over the years on this and related topics. I utilize data from the International Social Survey Program for what I'm sharing with you today. And this is really a culmination of dozens of studies that I've published, some individually, by myself, and others I've co-authored with other colleagues at UVU. And so I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Maureen Andrade, who we've been close collaborators the last couple of years since she joined my department, and we've published a bunch of articles together. Dr. Doug Miller, Dr. Jeff Peterson, Dr. Bernd Kupka, all who have also been co-authors on different articles. And currently we have a new focus looking at this topic, but specifically with comparative international look at gender differences in the workplace and implications for female workers. And my wife, Jackie Westover, is working on that project with me, as well as Angela Schill in my department. And over the years, for the last decade, as I've been working on all of these related projects, I've had lots and lots of students who have worked with me, probably too many to specifically mention. Some grad assistants, lots of undergrad students who have worked on various projects and gone with me to present at conferences and publish articles and such. So anyways, I need to give my my acknowledgement to all of the efforts and contributions that all of these other individuals have made that will be represented in what I'm sharing with you today. All right, let me move on in my slides. There's a lot of text on this slide. I'm not actually going to read all of this, but I will just mention that I put a PDF of my slide deck in the files in Teams. So if you want to get into my slide deck and read through this, kind of in-depth agenda slide, an overview slide, feel free to do that. But at the bottom, you can see, what I plan to focus on, an overview of COVID-19 impact on work and economies, 2 technological innovations influencing shifting working conditions, the COVID-19 accelerating the shift to a new normal in the workplace and the future of work in the post-pandemic world, and then finally policy questions and implications related to economic and employee well-being. That is what I'll try to hit on in the next little bit, and I'll also try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. But don't hesitate to chime in if any of you would like to ask questions along the way. I am more than happy to field questions throughout as well. All right, to lay the groundwork for this a little bit, I just wanted to give a little bit of a contextual overview to my main theoretical perspective. I am an HR professor. I teach in the organizational leadership department. I am a believer in the value of human capital, and perhaps human capital as even the most valuable asset that an organization has at its disposal as it's trying to carry out its mission and provide value in the marketplace. If we want to have a competitive advantage, we can do that through efficiencies, through processes, through intellectual property, through technologies. There's lots of ways we can do it, and companies have lots of different forms of capital to try to do that. Anyone who's taken Econ 101, plant, equipment, property, you have intellectual property, and you have financial capital, you have your human capital. The reason why I think human capital is so important is because it's the people that ultimately are going to do the creativity and innovation that's going to help the organization differentiate itself and achieve success in the marketplace. So even with the best technologies, even with the most efficient processes, if you don't have good people, if you're not attracting and retaining good people and leveraging their capabilities and potential and giving them an opportunity to contribute in meaningful ways, doing their best work, in the things that they enjoy doing the most. If that's not happening in the aggregate on a regular basis, organizations can't thrive sustainably. That's the main premise behind really everything that I'll be presenting today and all of this research. And so really I start with a foundational bias towards people-centric and people-centered organizations that we need to value our people, we need to invest in our people, we need to create organizations with dynamic and cultures and environments of inclusivity, belonging, and diversity. And ultimately, as we start to leverage those capabilities that everyone brings to the table, that's when the organization is going to be most successful. And on this slide, you can see this is a summary figure that really highlights some of the major research findings in this area. And there's many more. There's lots of outcomes, lots of positive outcomes for having people-centric organizations and creating a high-performance work system. Ultimately, though, I just chose a few to put on this slide, and you can see the flow of how these variables interact with each other. And so at the top, you see interesting jobs. So think about interesting work, meaningful work, the type of work that you get excited about, getting up in the morning. Even though it's hard and there may be aspects of it that are tedious, you still are excited and you're engaged and you're ready to go and you're ready to tackle the difficulties. That's what we're trying to do if we want to have a high performance work system and if we value our people, is create really meaningful and interesting jobs. When you have interesting work, that leads to more satisfied workers and more engaged workers. When you have more engaged workers they're more motivated, they have better interactions with customers, that drives customer satisfaction. It also decreases negative behaviors in the workplace. So things like absenteeism and turnover reduce dramatically when we have more engaged, satisfied, and motivated workers. And when that's the case, that lowers cost. When we have more satisfied customers, we retain more customers, we have more brand loyalty, that leads to higher sales, and both the higher sales and the lower cost lead to higher profits. Nobody's going to argue against higher profits for an organization. And so as you look through this flow, you can see, kind of the business case for why people-centric organizations is really important. But setting that aside for a moment, I would also just encourage you, even without the business case for it, which is clear and is evidenced throughout the literature, that the human argument is very important. That we want to treat people with dignity and respect. We want to show that we value them, and we want dynamic, inclusive organizational cultures, and that has inherent intrinsic value in and of itself, even if it didn't lead to better performance for the company or for the organization. Fortunately, we don't have to pick and choose. Like, we get to have both. So if we focus on people-centric organizations, we will have more innovative, productive organizations, but we'll also have people that thrive and people that feel valued and have the opportunity to contribute in meaningful ways. On the bottom of the graphic, you can see another kind of input. So if we want to create an innovative culture, we want people to push the envelope and really try to better understand how they can create value in the marketplace, then we need to create a knowledge sharing environment. So, just as a very simple example, something like this seminar series, where people are encouraged to share their research and share their disciplinary insights across campus in an interdisciplinary fashion. Just doing simple things like that, where people are encouraged to share with each other their expertise, what they know, what they understand, and over time, as you promote that, people recognize that they are encouraged to speak up, they're encouraged to share, they're encouraged to work across the aisle, work with people who may be in completely different disciplines than them, completely different functional areas than them. All of that then creates an environment where you have greater innovation within the organization. Greater innovation leads to higher quality and more satisfied customers, higher sales, higher profits. Also, that knowledge sharing environment, that culture, that creates opportunities for efficiencies and greater productivity among your people, and that will lead to higher profits. So again, there's a lot going on in this slide, and I really could probably talk about it for another hour without even moving on. But I just wanted to lay a little bit of the groundwork for the business case behind why this is so important, everything that we're talking about today, and also to make the human case that we really need to value our people to help them maximize their potential and to have a chance to leverage the collective genius, of our people to drive innovation, to drive better outcomes for the organization. Now, we've all been living in this COVID environment, but even before COVID hit and we had so many people had to start working remotely, and that was aided, of course, by various technologies, there were significant technological innovations that have been influencing the shifting work conditions and the very nature of work for a long time. We often talk about the fourth industrial revolution. We're in the middle of that, but really since the first industrial revolution, and really throughout all human history, we see anytime there's some new sort of technological innovation, that it disrupts the nature of work, and it changes the way people do their work and how they interact with each other. What we've seen in just the last decade, due to lower costs for computer memory and exponentially increasing computing capacity, that the technological shifts and innovations have been even more extreme. And so there's just a laundry list of disruptive technologies that have come into the world just in the last decade or two that are going to fundamentally change over time. They're going to fundamentally change what it looks like to be an employee, what it looks like to work with an organization, and what it means to do meaningful work. Some examples, I mean, I'm sure you've talked and thought a lot about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, blockchain, pharmacogenetics, driving vehicles, robotics. I mean, there's just so many things. The list goes on and on and on. All of these disruptive technologies that ultimately are going to replace a lot of the more routinized types of tasks that we do as part of our job. And it also highlights, though, the types of work that will be very difficult to replace. So as I think about my job as a professor, and what my job looks like today versus what it looked like when I started 11 years ago versus what it might look like in another 10 years, I suspect there will continue. It's already shifted a lot, and I expect it'll continue to shift quite dramatically. And so I need to learn, like, what types of behaviors, what types of value do I add to the organization in order to set myself apart so that I'm still employable, right? And we all need to think about that question because what we've done in the past won't necessarily translate to what needs to be done in the future. So this next slide shows some of the skills that are needed in the future workplace and those drivers of change. So on the outside ring, you see those drivers. So we have an increasingly computational world. We have superstructured organizations. And we could argue about all of these and say whether they're good or bad, but the reality is they just are. They exist. So this is happening, and whether it's good or bad or you're indifferent to it, this is the context that we're in. We're in a globally interconnected world, increasingly so. We have new media ecology constantly, new forms of media coming about, new communication tools. We have new smart systems and machines. And simply the demographics of humanity continue to shift, where lifespans continue to increase, the longevity of workers and the viable number of years that we can remain in the labor force continues to increase. So what does that mean for how we upskill and reskill ourselves over time? These are all the types of questions we need to be thinking about. So in the middle of this diagram, you see some of those different skills that are needed. And these are all skills that if we have, we will survive just fine as the nature of work shifts as driven through technological advancement and these other drivers. Things like cognitive load management. We need to have cognitive agility, and we need to be able to be highly adaptive, and we need to be able to manage and juggle a lot of complexity. Virtual collaboration. Now we're living that right now, right? At this moment, I'm sitting in the corner of my bedroom while I'm presenting to people across campus, and probably your home offices and bedrooms as well. And we do have a lot of opportunity for collaboration. In fact, I would say that since COVID happened, I've been doing a lot more international collaboration than I had done even previously, simply because everyone has shifted their mindset towards these virtual opportunities, and so it's just so easy to hop on with anyone. Just earlier this morning, I was talking with a colleague in Tel Aviv, and when we had a really great conversation, and that's awesome. And there's no reason why we can't continue to explore those types of virtual collaborations. We need to be literate within new media. We need to have cross-cultural competencies, adaptive thinking, sense-making, design thinking, transdisciplinarity, and we could add others. I'm sure there are other important ones that would also go into the skills that are needed for the future of work. But ultimately, these are our value-added proposition as human workers in organizations. Anything that's routine, any skill set that can easily be replaced by robots, computers, or new technologies. Simply, we won't that if that's what our job is and we can't adapt, then our jobs will likely be displaced over time. And again, that's not even, there's no value judgment there. It just is. That's a fact of the situation. Okay, so now let me, with that as groundwork, let me get into summarizing some of the studies that have been completed over the last decade in relation to this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I utilize data from the International Social Survey Program. I first got connected with this really rich data set back when I was working on my master's thesis. And at the time, there were only two waves of this data from 1989 and 1997. And then, as I was moving into my dissertation and my PhD, the next wave was released, the 2007 wave. And since then, there was yet another wave, the 2015 wave, and there will be another wave of this data that comes out in another couple of years. I share that with you simply because if you find this presentation interesting or any of the variables that I'm looking at interesting, this is you can look at this data. It's publicly available, and there's even some for limited types of descriptive analyses and basic kind of comparative descriptive data. You can even do some of that just right on the website through some of their interactive tools. So it's really, really cool. And you can get access to the full data sets to run all of your more complex inferential statistics and things like that as well, as you like. So as it stands right now, there's 4 waves of this data, the work orientations, and there's hundreds of questions that look at various aspects of work, the nature of work, people's experience in the workplace, the types of organizations they live in or that they work in, other living conditions, and their own personal living situation. So all of that provides a lot of richness and a lot of opportunity for analysis. And in the most recent wave, there were 37 countries involved. So this map shows you the countries that were included in the data analysis. And each wave, they've added more countries. So all the way back in 1989, there were only 11 countries involved. In 97, it went up to 18. In 5, it was up to 28. And then in this last wave, it was up to 37. So it's an increasingly robust and cross-national data set. Okay, here you can see the main model and all the different variables that have gone into what I've been exploring over the last decade. So on outside the box, you have these contextual variables. So various country-specific context and country-specific culture. Within the country-specific context, there's lots of economic variables. You think of all the socioeconomic and geopolitical types of conditions that exist within a particular country. That's what I'm trying to control for as I include those contextual variables, so that as I look at variations across countries in the nature of work and the experience of workers in the workplace and job satisfaction, that I can tease out like what's happening there. Is it just what's happening in the person's job, or is it also these more macro contextual types of factors? And then the country specific cultural variables, these are all taken from the GLOBE project. Some of you might be familiar with that. There's a whole range of different variables. The most recent data released by the GLOBE project is now getting a little dated. It's a little over a decade old, and they're working on updating it But they basically categorize different societies in terms of a wide range of cultural characteristics and dimensions. So controlling for those cultural characteristics and dimensions, as well as the socioeconomic and geopolitical factors, you can start to have a sense of what macro variables are impacting versus what micro variables are impacting the nature of work and jobs. Now, inside the box, you can see all of the kind of core analysis. Oh, I should back up too. For anyone who loves statistics, the way this model works is it's a hierarchical linear model. So when you're actually running the statistics, you have one level where you look at these contextual variables outside the box and how they impact everything inside the box. And then from there, you run a second model where you're controlling not only for the individual control variables inside the box, but you're also continuing to control for the contextual variables outside the box. And ultimately, you can see how they all connect with each other in terms of the outcome variable or the dependent variable. So that's what I've done in these analyses, even though I won't get into all of those kinds of outputs and results in this short presentation. For individual control variables, basic things like gender, age, education, marital status, size of family. There are other variables that would be really great to include, but as in any situation when you're dealing with secondary data, you're limited to the variables that are there, right? So there are other things I would love to include, but for the variables that are included across all 37 countries, these are the individual and family control variables. And then for organizational and job characteristics control variables, work hours, job classification, code, so you can see exactly what type of job, what industry they're in, supervisory status, employment relationship, whether it's a public or private organization. Those are those consistent control variables across the 37 countries. And then we get into the meat of those variables that I think are really driving employee motivation, engagement, and job satisfaction. So we have work-life balance variables, intrinsic rewards, extrinsic rewards, and work relations. In the work-life balance category, you have working from home, working weekends, schedule flexibility, flexibility to deal with family matters, and the extent to which work interferes with family. The intrinsic variables are interesting work, job autonomy, helping others, and job being useful to society as a whole. Extrinsic variables include job security, pay, promotional opportunities, physical effort, and work stress. And the work relations include relationships with your coworkers, relationship with management, your contact with others throughout the nature of your work, and the extent to which you experience discrimination in the workplace or harassment in the workplace. And then all of this then feeds into job satisfaction. Okay, so just real high level, quick descriptive comparison as we look at job satisfaction across countries. So this is based on the 2015 data, and we can see the mean scores. Oh, and I apologize, I'm looking at it. This graph doesn't include the names of all the countries. It includes about half of them. I just need to stretch it out a little bit more so all of the names will pop up. Anyways, all 37 countries are included here, and you can see that there is, of course, variation in job satisfaction levels across countries. And you have some countries that are particularly high. This 5.8, I believe, is one of the Nordic countries. Over here, you can see Denmark, 5.5. That's one of the higher ones. And Venezuela all the way at the end at 5.9, and this is on a 7-point Likert scale. And then we have on the low end, you have some Asian countries, China 4.7, Japan 4.5, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head this 4.8. Russia's right next to it, so it's not Russia. Anyways. there's a lot of variation. So then the question emerges, well, why? Why is there all this variation in job satisfaction? Is work that much worse in China and Japan than it is in, say, Nordic countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, some of these places? And if it's not just the nature of work itself that's significantly different, what are some of those drivers in terms of the socioeconomic and geopolitical factors, the cultural factors that could be influencing the perceptions of workers within these countries, and how motivated, engaged, and satisfied they are with their work? Here's just one other quick descriptive slide looking at job satisfaction by age. So for this graphic, this is just all employees globally in all 37 of those countries. And we can see variation by age. The overall mean for job satisfaction, regardless of age, is a little over 5.3. But you can see that workers who are younger start off with higher job satisfaction, then it dips quickly, and then it's fairly steady across kind of those main first employable years. And then something super interesting happens, and as people get older, they start to experience even more satisfaction in their work towards the tail end of their career. And we know that, as I mentioned earlier, that people are working longer and longer. So traditionally, we thought of 65 as kind of that retirement age, and some people still really are still shooting for that, but increasingly people are retiring at 70, 75, or even later. And so, of course, anyone who's working at 85 plus and their job satisfaction shoots off the chart, I imagine they're only doing stuff that they really love, that they really enjoy. Otherwise, they just wouldn't even be doing it. Okay, now here, let me move this. Here you can see the main regression results just in building that main model. So what I did, and anyone who does a lot of statistics, this is just a basic ordinary least squared regression, and I started with all these control variables. This is all the stuff that's inside that box, that model that I showed you earlier. And so you run all the base model controls, and you do each chunk of variables separately as you build the model and try to figure out what the best possible model is overall. And along the bottom, you can see the adjusted R squared. That's the overall amount of variability in the outcome variable or the dependent variable that can be explained by the independent variables or the model variables. So for example, in this base model, these are just control variables, right? And you can see all of them except for family size are statistically significant. And overall, though, they only predict about 3% of variability in job satisfaction. Here we can see the intrinsic factors, and those intrinsic factors they're all significant. They predict about 25% of variability in job satisfaction. And then we have the extrinsic factors, they're all significant. They predict about another 20% of variation in job satisfaction. Then we have the workplace relationships, that's about 22.5%. And then we have work-life balance factors, and that predicts about 8% of job satisfaction. So all of these are significant. We then combine it all into one main combined model, and that's what we see here on the far column. And when all of these variables are inputted in the regression together, and so then we're simultaneously controlling for each and every other variable within the model as well, the collective predictability of the model for all employees and all job types and all types of organizations across all countries is about 43%. So this model predicts about 43% of the variation in job satisfaction for employees globally. Now, that's interesting, I suppose. But then what's really interesting is when you start to look at differences across countries and trying to understand the reasons for those differences. And here in this figure, you can just see model predictability across countries. So my last graph where I didn't have all the countries listed, they're all here, so you can see them on this one. And there's huge variation in the amount of predictability across when that base model, when that main model is applied across all 37 countries. So in Australia, it predicts 63% of variation in job satisfaction, but it's only 27% in China, and it's only 15% in the Philippines. You can see that overall mean is about 43%, and countries that are above and below. In the U.S., it's a little bit more predictive than the global mean, and a lot of countries it's kind of right around the mean, or anyways. So I think that's interesting in and of itself. And then we're trying to figure out, well, why? So, for example, in that last graph, the overall level of job satisfaction in Japan is one of the lowest in the world, at least for those 37 countries. But the model actually overperforms in Japan. So the model explains 56% of the variability as opposed to kind of the global mean of 43%. So that's interesting. And I've spent probably 30 plus academic papers parsing through all of these differences across slicing the data in all of these different types of ways and trying to understand what's going on between all of these different countries, within these countries, across job types, across genders, across all sorts of things. Okay, so that's as much as I wanted to get into in terms of the statistics for this presentation. But a few things to note in terms of some results, some future research. I showed you as an example just that age and job satisfaction graph, and analysis does show that age has a positive, statistically significant impact on job satisfaction, and it's also a significant control variable in the model for all respondents with that positive relationship. There's also clearly cross-national differences in the impact of age. So if we're just slicing the data just to look at age and the role of age on job satisfaction globally, there's some interesting things to find. But we can slice it in so many different ways. We can look at sector and occupational category. We can look at job type. We can look at supervisory status. We can look at gender differences. We can look at specific differences across specific countries, and it's super interesting. This research does support previous findings about age, but there still continues to need a need for better understanding of how age-based differences in worker satisfaction relates to other organizational, institutional, economic, social, and individual outcomes. So, from a research perspective, that's kind of a real quick run through of kind of this large body of research that I've been a part of over the last decade, and lots of other academics have been a part of as well. Now I want to shift and take, how are we doing on time? I'll try to only take about 10 more minutes, and then we can leave the rest of time for Q&A. So now I want to shift towards practitioner orientation. So what does this all mean, beyond, publishing in an academic journal? Who's going to find value in this? And my hope is that leaders in organizations would find this information very important and valuable. One of the things that we see consistently in the data across waves, over time, and across countries is that meaningful work matters. So if people are motivated and they're engaged and they're satisfied with their jobs when they have interesting and meaningful work, where they have an opportunity to do what they do best, at least a little bit each and every day, to make a real contribution. If we know that, then that has implications for how we need to be leading our teams. So a few possible questions that we can ask ourselves, that we can ask our people. Why does it matter if employees find their work interesting? Is that just a nice to have, or is that something that we really need to try to build into the very design and nature of the work that we have our people do? How can I demonstrate to my employees that their work benefits the broader society? Now, we work at an educational institution. This one's probably not very difficult for most of us. As an academic, I can see the value in how I benefit society by interacting with my students and preparing them for their future careers, and to be productive citizens and active citizens in their communities to better the world around them. That has real meaning, that has real value. I also have a lot of interest in my work just because, as academics, we get to do a lot of different things, right? We get to
dabble in a bunch of different things. We get to explore our interests. We get to focus on those things that are most important to us. And that's actually quite a unique facet of the work that we do. And not everyone's as fortunate to have that amount of flexibility in how they design their own work experience. But that makes for interesting work. How do my employees feel about their work? Do they find, I might try to design a work environment and jobs that I think are interesting and meaningful, but how does that translate over to what my people actually think and what's salient drivers to them? All the data that I was just showing you was super macro level. You can drill down into really individual level types of outcomes, but even then, ultimately, it's one thing to talk about the data in a statistical model. It's a totally different thing altogether to go into a team of people. Say I'm a manager and I have 5 people that report to me or something, and actually knowing them, knowing their salient factors, knowing what motivates them, and all sorts of things influence that. Life stage influences that. Family dynamics and what's going on at home influences that. So there's just so many different things, and ultimately we need to know our people, or if we hope to create meaningful work. And how can I better design the jobs of my team so the work they do is more meaningful? And frankly, there's a lot of things that you can do that are low cost or no cost to increase meaning and purpose in the work that people do. So it's I'm not talking about like hiring a high price consultant. There may be a time and a place for that, or some new program. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything complex, but there's a lot that you can do that's low cost or no cost that can start to make an immediate impact. Another important area is job autonomy. People want to have the opportunity to make decisions about how they perform their job, right? And that's actually one of the things I value the most about my job currently, is that I have so much autonomy. And I'm someone who likes to be productive, and I don't want to spin my wheels or waste my time on things. And so job autonomy is awesome because that means I get to design my experience at work each and every day, as long as I'm productive and as long as I get stuff done. And as leaders, providing more opportunity for job autonomy means we have to let go of some control. We need to trust in our people, and we need to empower them to do their best work. And when we can do that, and they can learn how to exercise appropriately their own job autonomy, then things can really thrive within organizations. We could go on and on. In terms of some of those work-life balance factors, working from home and scheduling flexibility have been big determinants of engagement, motivation, and job satisfaction for employees. And it's one of those biggest factors in terms of attracting and retaining good people within an organization consistently over time. And that certainly is played out in my data analysis in this international sample. I think this is particularly relevant, though, as we continue to move into the future of work, and as we see an acceleration into that future based on this COVID dynamic that we're all a part of. I've worked remotely before, but it hasn't been until COVID happened that became my predominant mode of work. And my wife also works from home. My kids are all doing online school, right? We're all navigating all of this virtual work and working from home. With that comes scheduling flexibility if the employer will allow for it. So then it doesn't really matter when I'm doing my work. I'm not always the greatest sleeper. And so if I'm up at like 4 a.m. and I know there's no chance of me getting back to sleep, I can get up and work, and I don't need to wait until 8 o'clock. Likewise, I don't need to do simply 8 to 5. There's oftentimes that I will take breaks during the day. I'll work early. I'll take a break during the day. I'll work into the evening after the kids are in bed. Those types of situations, I think we're all feeling out and trying to determine what works best for us and our families. I have 6 children who are all doing online school, right? And so that is a dynamic that requires a level of flexibility for me to care for my family situation while also trying to meet my obligations for my employer, UVU, right? And so as a manager, as I can provide appropriate scheduling flexibility, I can provide reasonable working from home options, that can do a lot to ease the pressure that people are feeling, particularly during something like a pandemic. And people highly value that, and they appreciate the effort that employers make to allow for that. And coming back to what I mentioned earlier about that acceleration into the future of work, because of rapidly increasing disruptive technologies, I don't think we're going to ever be going back to the way things used to be. This, in fact, I believe has only sped up the process for how things are going to continue to shift. So we need to, and we've all been living it, we've all been adapting to it. And I think in some ways that's been a really healthy challenge for all of us amidst this pandemic to try to learn how to grapple with this, because it's going to be part of our reality for a long time to come. Flexibility to deal with family matters. I'm running short on time, so I'm not going to read all these questions, but there's a lot of good questions to consider as a manager or as a leader. What can I do to allow more opportunity for flexibility for my people? Reducing work interference with family, having weekends off. There's lots of research that demonstrates the value of these aspects. And I think part of it just comes back to understanding and recognizing that our people, the people in our organizations, our employees, have complex lives. Some employers, some leaders have the mindset of keep your home life at home, and when you're at work, just work and leave everything else to the side. I fundamentally disagree with that approach. I think it's wrong for so many reasons. If for nothing else, it just simply is not realistic. There's just no possible way that people who, say you're caring for an elderly parent who is immunocompromised right now during COVID, and you're trying to figure out how do you them and helping your kids with online school and doing your work. If your employer is expecting you to just somehow compartmentalize, and that's not going to impact your productivity at work and your ability to contribute and innovate and all of that, they're just fooling themselves, plain and simple. And the research bears that out. That's not just my opinion. There's so much research to demonstrate that. And so we need, it's just the reality that we are living in. And that means we need to find ways to show more empathy to our people. We need to find ways to be more supportive of them, and ultimately give them the flexibility that they need so that they can juggle everything that they're doing. And then that can, again, as I mentioned earlier, that can lead to greater organizational commitment, greater levels of trust. People in organizations that have this kind of a dynamic that I've been describing, they are so much more loyal. They're willing to put up with more. They're willing to do more. And they're willing to stick around even when things are really rough, and they're willing to weather storms because they know that their boss has their back. And conversely, people know when their boss doesn't have their back, and they know when they're looking for reasons to get rid of them. They know when their employer doesn't trust them, or and that certainly that manifests itself in various micromanaging behaviors. There's just so much here to think about, and unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go into as much depth as I would hope. But that gives you a taste, at least. And if you're interested in finding out more about any of this, feel free to reach out to me. There's lots of studies that I've published along these topics that give more specific detail. And the bottom line is there's a lot that we can do to enhance the experience of our people, both in regular kind of times as well as in the current COVID environment. And as we come out of COVID, whenever that is, whether it's another 6 months, another year, however long, our people will remember. They'll remember how we treated them during this time, and they'll remember as more and more organizations will have ongoing virtual work arrangements. They will have people will have more options, so there will be a lot of more movement in the labor force. So we need to value our people now. We need to make sure that they understand why we're a great place to be and that we're investing in them. And if we can do that, then I think that's the surefire recipe to drive sustainable long-term organizational success. Okay, I'm talking too much, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll leave the remainder of the time, and I'm happy to stay past 1 even. So the remainder of the time for any questions, and yeah, feel free to just unmute yourself, chime in, or put it in the chat.
Okay, so I've got a question. We live in a kind of a litigious society. Does your research show the effects of the positive environment that you're speaking of in the workforce, and valuing your employees decreases the propensities for litigation?
Yeah, it really does, and it does in a very major way. And you're right, we do live in a litigious society, and so a big part of my field of HR is compliance in employment law, and there's lots of things you have to do, and there's lots of minefields and traps that you can fall into if you're not careful. That's the reality. So we don't want to dismiss the importance of the legalities and the compliance issues, but there's a fundamental difference between an organization that's focusing on its people versus an organization that's more fear-based and compliance-oriented. And more fear-based, compliance-focused organizations almost always are not people-focused organizations. People-focused organizations also then tend to have much fewer incidents of litigation. People find, there's fewer incidents of sexual harassment experiences or other types of negative workplace behaviors that can even lead to those types of litigation experiences. But even when those do exist, when people feel like they're in a people-centered organization where their leaders value them and where their leaders have their back and trust them, they're going to be far more likely to try to work through problems with their leaders and with their boss, rather than feel like the only way through the challenge they're facing is to bring in a lawyer and file a formal complaint with the Department of Labor and file a lawsuit. And it's really unfortunate when that happens, but too often organizations can inadvertently kind of spiral down into an overly compliance-based kind of a fear-based culture. And when that happens, it starts to manifest in a lot of different ways. Just the policies, the practices, and procedures that start to really demonstrate the culture to the people, and then people realize that my employer doesn't trust me. My employer is looking for ways to stick it to me. My employer is looking for ways to get rid of me. They're looking for ways to cover their butt rather than trying to look out for their people. When we start down that negative spiral, it's big trouble. And so we need to recognize the reality of compliance issues. We need, of course, to do everything in accordance with the law and correctly. But it's true that when we focus on our people and we invest in our people, they're more engaged, they're more happy, they're more satisfied. The incidence of negative workplace behaviors goes way down, and the incidence of these types of litigation experiences go down.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How do companies who are so focused on the bottom line, when the profit is the most important thing, how do they balance that with their employees, and getting the employees to perform in the manner that they want them to?
Yeah, I mean, from my viewpoint, it's really a difference between a short-term versus a long-term perspective. The research is super clear. If you invest in your people and create dynamic cultures that are diverse and inclusive and create, an environment of belonging and meaning and purpose, when you do that, and that takes investment, that takes attention from organizational leaders, but when you do that, it leads to so many positive outcomes for the individual employees and for the organization as a whole. So in the long term, it's way better for the bottom line when an organization focuses on those things. However, in the short term, it can look, it can hurt the way you appear, and that's part of the trouble we have with our short-term orientation in the U.S., for example. Everything is driven so much by quarterly earnings reports and just like these immediate kind of orientations that we have, that we want to see progress right now. And because of that, a lot of times what ends up happening is that you're pushing people to get results now that will ultimately hurt you and undermine your own efforts in the long term. And that, I think, it's not a mutually exclusive goal to have to make money and have profits, as well as value your people. And there's so many really great examples of that, of companies that have done that. And you can do comparative studies of organizations that take a fear-based, compliance-based, profit-focused approach versus companies in the same industry, doing the same types of work, same products and services, who take a people-centric first approach. And what it demonstrates is it's a false dichotomy. It's not a trade-off. You can do both. So that's how I would respond to that question. Though it's obviously gets more complex than that when you start to get into the details.
We are excited about the launch of HCI's new magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine designed to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We will be publishing issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Check out the first issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.